Hey everybody! So today we're going to talk about how to create a nonprofit organization step by step. Hey everybody! So this is Tiffany here with Boss on a Budget. I help new and small nonprofits get up and running. And today is going to be a longer video because I wanted to break down step by step how to start your nonprofit organization. So if you Google how to start a nonprofit, you're going to find a lot of information, but sometimes it can be difficult to find everything in one place. And then, when you want to start and you're excited, you want people to tell you, just tell me what to do. Just tell me step by step. So I've created a nonprofit checklist. The link is in the description box below. And it does that. It gives you step by step how to create a nonprofit, what to consider, what paperwork to file, all of that. But I wanted to create a video to accompany the checklist because sometimes looking at paper is just not enough. And some of us are not, if you just give somebody a piece of paper, it's just not good enough. Sometimes you need to hear somebody walk through the process with you so you can feel confident about doing this. One thing that I will say is that if you have a lot of questions or you have a complicated tax situation, you should consider talking to a lawyer and a tax professional before you get started because having a nonprofit does have implications for you personally if you're the founder and for the people who serve on your board, and you should understand what you're getting yourself into. So if you have a lot of questions, I completely recommend that you talk to a professional first before you go down this road. Also, a nonprofit may not get you what you need. You may be able to accomplish what you're trying to do with a for-profit business. So just consider that, and it would be helpful to talk to a lawyer or a professional before you do that. That being said, I know plenty of people who have started their own nonprofits. They've done the paperwork themselves, and it can be a really easy process. So I don't want to discourage you that you can't do it, but if you do have a lot of questions and you don't feel comfortable, you should talk to a professional. I've done nonprofit paperwork for folks, and again, you can do it yourself. It's just a matter of how comfortable you feel. But this video is just my experience and what I believe you should consider in starting your nonprofit and going through all the steps for doing that. Okay. So I like to break down this by phases. So I'm going to talk about the steps within the different phases or the different sections of things you need to consider when starting your nonprofit. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is idea and development, that phase. So some people, when they start their nonprofit, they go right for the paperwork. They just look up at their state what they need to fill out, and it can be really easy, and they just go forward. They figure out who in their family or who in their circle of friends could be on their board. They just write their names on the paper, and then they go through and they're accepted and they get their status and they're like, yes, we can get started. I actually don't recommend doing that. I recommend kind of working what some people would think is backwards, but it's not really backwards. I recommend you work on your idea first. I recommend that you think about what it is you're trying to do and what is the positive impact you're trying to have, and make sure that that idea is solid before you move forward with engaging people, talking to the state, and going to the federal government to get your status. Sometimes people create nonprofits with an idea that's not necessarily a need in the community. So you have to figure out, do people even want the service you're providing? Do people even need it? Because there has to be a demand. And you also have to consider that there may be people in your community who are doing the same exact thing as you, and it can be a really crowded space. Now, some people will say, if it's crowded, don't do it. You don't need to start a nonprofit. Get a fiscal sponsor and do it under the umbrella of someone else. I actually don't necessarily agree with that. I think that if you find that the market is saturated and the service is already being provided, there's surely a niche or there's surely a population that's being underserved or being ignored. And so your job is to figure out who that is and speak to those people, because there are certainly around the country people and populations of people who are not getting what they need. So I don't believe in that. Oh, there's a nonprofit that's well established, that's already doing that. Just get under them. No, they may have a different approach to the work. They may have a different style. There may be a model that they use that's not appropriate for a population you want to work with. And you may know that population and say, no, that's not going to work. This is going to work. I believe in this. So if that's you, if you have a niche, if there is a need, then I would say, yes, keep moving forward. But just make sure you're clear on what is the true impact on what I'm trying to do? What is the positive outcome? Because you're going to have to convince people to get behind you. And if it's not a compelling enough idea, you're going to have a hard way to go. So you have to get people on your board who are just as passionate and committed. So it has to be some kind of great idea that people can get behind. And then you want people to donate. You want people to give their time for your organization. And again, if you have not figured out a compelling ask or gone through the steps to figure out why is this important? Why is this needed? It's going to be hard to get people to want to donate to you. So spend some time working on your idea and figuring out what it is you actually want to do, and just make sure you carve out a unique space, because you being unique in the space is what's going to get you where you need to go. The other thing you need to consider in the idea and development phase is getting your board together then. Not putting the paperwork together and then figuring out who's going to be on your board. Put your board together first, simply because you're going to have to put your board members on the paperwork. So you want to make sure that you have a solid group of people before you move forward. And you want kind of a group consensus about, is this a good idea? How should we move forward? You as a nonprofit founder should never feel like you're doing this alone. So you need to start from the beginning of understanding who you want around you in your circle, who's going to be that tight-knit circle to help launch y'all to success, right? So think about the skill sets you want on the board, the personalities you want on the board, the life experience you want on the board, and start looking for people, start recruiting for people who fit that criteria, so you can outfit a strong group of people who can make sure you're successful. In the description box below, I'm going to link my board recruitment toolbox. It includes materials that can help you figure out how to recruit and how to find people. But the big takeaway from this is that you need to find your board first. You need to come up with a solid group first, then you start filling out paperwork. Because then the next step is you guys need to come together and figure out what's the vision of your nonprofit, what's the mission of your nonprofit. And it will be so much better. It will be so much, a much richer statement or richer conversation when you do it as a group, instead of you as a nonprofit founder, 11 o'clock at night, working on your idea. Bring people in to the process so it can be something that has a lot of perspective, a lot of depth, and a lot of input from people who have different experiences than you. It will be that much better and be that much greater. The other thing you need to do once you have a solid board of directors, you then need to start working on your bylaws. So you have your vision and you have your mission, then you work on your bylaws. So the bylaws are just the organizing document of your organization. It just dictates the laws and the policies around how your board is going to operate. So it'll talk about, you know, how many people on the board, what are the term limits, how do people roll off of the board, how to dissolve the organization, how often should the board meet. Those kinds of things are going to be in your bylaws, and those are things you're going to look to when you get into tight situations, or if somebody's being disruptive on the board, or you need help trying to figure out what the next step is. Having a good solid set of bylaws will help get you through those tough times. In each state, there are laws that govern how nonprofits operate. So I really recommend, instead of you Googling just any random bylaws, that you look for sample bylaws from your state so that it can reference the right state laws. Your nonprofit association should have some sample bylaws, or should be able to help you with this in your state. But also, you're going to typically go to your Secretary of State in your state to find out how to start your nonprofit, and they may also be able to help you with some sample bylaws. And they probably have some information about what needs to be in there. So some states will dictate how many people have to be on the board, what are the officers on the board, and all of that. So make sure you look for the information for your particular state. Once you have your board of directors, make sure you pick officers for your board. So make sure you have a president, a secretary, a treasurer, whatever. And again, your state laws are going to dictate what the offices should be. And then you may feel like you need other officers, but that stuff is going to be covered in your bylaws. And then once you have that straight, elect officers for the board so you can have a strong structure in place as you go forward. The next thing you need to think about is your name. So, based on what you've tossed around for your vision and for your mission, think about like if you had to, if you were 10 years down the road and you want a good representation of who you are, what name represents you as an organization? So take the time to figure out what you want as your name, what you want to represent yourself. Remember when you're thinking about your logo, remember when you're thinking about communications, is it easy to say? Is it easy to reference? Is there a website already taking your name? Are there other organizations who already have your name? So these are some of the things you need to think about when you're trying to figure out what the name is of your organization. One thing you can do is check with your state to make sure that the name isn't already taken. And then you should also check the federal trademarking database. And all these links are in my checklist. But make sure someone else hasn't trademarked the name because you don't want to create all these materials and stationery and pins with your name and your logo, and then come to find out someone wants to sue you because you're using their name. So make sure you're using a unique name, but something that's easy to reference when you want to tell people, hey, go to my website, blah blah blah. Make sure it's something easy for that. Okay. So you may also want to consider trademarking your name. It's always good to control your brand. It's always good to, make sure that no one's using it irresponsibly. And trademarking can protect you in times when people want to come in and use your name for other purposes. So that's something you need to consider. If you are conducting business under a different name, you may need to do a doing business as, a DBA. So just go through all the things you need to go through at your state to register your name and to do trademarking if necessary, so that all that stuff is clear before you move forward with your paperwork. The next phase is the execution phase. And this is the phase where I'm going to go through the paperwork and what it takes to actually establish you as an organization. So the first thing you need to do is, as a board, vote on the fact that you're going to incorporate as an actual business. Some people don't realize that in order to become a nonprofit, you have to incorporate as a business in the state. You don't go to the federal government first. The states regulate how businesses are created. So you're going to be subject to state law and state regulations in either the business where you're a resident or the state where you're a resident or the state where you're trying to do business. So you're going to be subject to those laws. So consider that when you're trying to figure out what state to incorporate in. You're usually going to go to the Secretary of State in that respective state to create your business structure. And in most circumstances, you're going to need to incorporate as a nonprofit organization. It may be called something different. In my state, it's called a non-stock corporation. So if you need help, make sure you call your Secretary of State so they can guide you through that. Every state is different. Every form name is different state by state. The fees are different state by state. So just remember that when you're starting your nonprofit, they're not all created equal. What happens in Georgia is different than what happens in Connecticut. So make sure you do your research first. Then you establish contact information and location and email address for your business so that you can have something to reference in the documents that you're creating. The next thing I'd suggest, and I'm not going to have the time to talk through all of this, but you're going to really have to create some kind of strategic plan to figure out what staff you need, what are the activities you're going to do over the next year, what is your budget, and how you're going to make up that budget. And it's important to do that first because the decisions that you make in this part or in this phase of your nonprofit has implications for the types of forms that you're going to fill out with the IRS and for the types of business you're going to do at the state level. So it's important to have some kind of plan in place. This is what we're going to accomplish. this year. These are our goals for the year. This is how we're going to do it. This is how much money we need to do it. And this is how we're going to raise money to do that. That has implications for a lot of things. So it's important to do that first before you go through with your paperwork. So as I said before, make sure you establish an operating budget. People get really intimidated by a budget, but it's not that serious. It really is asking yourself, based on what we want to accomplish this year, what is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? How much in staffing? How much in materials, insurance, all kinds of things like that. So just write down on a piece of paper. It can be really, really simple. This is what we think it's going to cost to do our programming this year and to do it well. So don't skirt yourself, okay? If that even makes sense. So don't like shortchange yourself. Don't say, "Oh, I don't think we can do that, so I'm not gonna put that in the budget." Whatever it takes, or whatever you think it's going to take to do what you're trying to do in the year, reflect that in the budget, and then think critically about, okay, if we really want to do this, this is what it's going to take to raise that money. So unless you have the goal to do what you really want to do, you're not going to meet the goal. So make sure you're realistic about what it is you're trying to do. The next thing you should think about is, how are you going to track expenses, right? So how are you going to track what's going out and what's coming in? So there are two different kinds of accounting methods that you need to consider. Once you are a nonprofit of a certain size, you have to use a certain method. But when you're starting small, you can do it. It depends. It can be your choice. So the two different accounting methods are cash and accrual. Accrual. So I'm not an accounting professional. I have some links in my checklist to help you figure out the difference between the two. But the basic difference is, cash is, you're just accounting the cash that you use at the time you get it or at the time it goes out. Accrual means that you may be expecting some money to come in, or you may be expecting money to go out. So you're doing your accounting based on what's expected, not necessarily what exists right now. That's the best way I can explain it, but there are some resources online for you to check that out. And again, I have links in the checklist. So once you decide how you're going to do your accounting, and most small and new nonprofits start with cash. Okay, they start with the cash accounting method. But when you get to a certain size, you're going to have to switch to accrual because it's a more realistic understanding of where you are financially. If I'm looking at your finances and it looks like you have money in the bank, but I don't realize that, oh, you have a bill out for, $100,000, that's not a realistic understanding of where you are. It could be the next day that that $100,000 comes out and it completely changes everything. So accrual just means you have a more realistic and more accurate understanding of where you are financially. You're going to have to decide what your accounting system is, whether it's going to be a spreadsheet or whether you're going to use QuickBooks or something like Xero or FreshBooks. So just make a decision early on and commit to it so you don't get too messy down the road. So if you are a nonprofit with 501c3 status, you can get a discounted rate for QuickBooks at techsoup.org. So check that out. But again, you have to have your status, and we're not there in the checklist yet. So just consider that as you go down the road. Make sure you have a system for bookkeeping. Make sure you have a policy in place for how you're going to collect money, who's responsible for collecting money, what those records should look like. Think about that early on, because once you get started, those things matter and you're going to need to know that, and you're going to have to explain that to your funders and to your donors. They're going to want to know you're being responsible. Okay, so the next phase is forms, federal and state forms, and all the administrative stuff you need to know and you need to consider when you are filing for your nonprofit. So first, get an EIN, an employer identification number, at the IRS website. So the link is in my checklist. It's a simple process, but you have to incorporate first before you get the EIN, and then tell the IRS what kind of business you are, what's your structure in order to get your EIN. Just remember, once you get your EIN, that stays your number forever. So if after the fact you get tax exempt status, so you get your 501c3 status, that becomes your 501c3 number. See how easy that is? So get your EIN on the IRS website, and it's online, it's quick, it's easy. Then what you're going to do is establish a bank account. Make sure you're clear on who's the signatory on the account, who's authorized to write checks, whose name is going to be on the bank account. And remember, this is important, and you're already prepared because you have your board in place. So you've made decisions about who the treasurer is, who the president is, and more than likely they're going to be at least the two people who are going to be on your bank account. All right. So then you can move forward with your 501c3 status. So notice how this is a little bit down the line. You got to get your tax exempt status later. You have to do it after you incorporate as a nonprofit, after you get your EIN and all of that. So then you can do that using Form 1023. Now there are two types of forms. There's the long form and then there's the EZ form. The long form is more expensive and more extensive in the type of information that they want. The easy form is an easier, quicker process and it's less money. The easy form is for smaller nonprofits who are new, who are just getting started, and who don't expect to bring in a lot of money and don't have complicated structures. That's who the easy form is for. So the IRS has an eligibility worksheet that you can use to figure out if you are eligible for the easy form, and if you are, that's much quicker. The 1023 form is a long form that actually mirrors your tax form that you have to fill out every year as a nonprofit. So it's a good exercise to do the long form so you can prepare yourself and prepare your systems to collect information the way the IRS wants it reported. So it's still good to go through the long form and figure out and try to answer the questions so you can be prepared as an organization. But the easy form is an easy, simple process that you can use to get your tax exempt status. And just remember, 501c3 is not the only tax exempt status with the federal government. There are a lot of different 501s. There's a 501c4, I think it's a 501c7, I think it's up to like 27 different types of 501cs. The most popular is 501c3 because most funders give to those types of organizations. But just remember, that's not the only tax exempt status. So check it out and see if there are other tax exempt statuses that may benefit you more. Okay? After you do the tax exempt status with the federal government, you may be exempt from some kind of state tax. So you may want to check out your Secretary of State and figure out is there paperwork that you need to fill out, or are there forms you can fill out to be exempt from any kind of state tax. Okay, so the next phase is about fundraising. So there's a couple of things you need to do to make sure you're on the up and up with your fundraising activities. So first, your state may require that you put a disclosure statement on your tax receipts or on your donor letters or on your website. And this disclosure statement will just say, if you want to find more about our financial records, please contact us, or here's a link to our tax forms. You can check with the Secretary of State to find out more information about us. It just depends on the language that your state requires, and your state will spell it out for you. So again, there's a link in my checklist that shows a website that will list all the different state requirements that you need for your disclosure form. The other thing you need to think about is charitable solicitation. Okay, so if you have never heard of this, you need to get up on this immediately. In order to raise money in any state, you have to be approved to raise money. And the reason why that's important is because states want to protect their residents from scammers. So you have to register with the Secretary of State if you're soliciting for money from an individual or from an organization in the state. So that means if you're in, like, my state, Maryland, and you're raising money in DC, or you're raising money in Virginia, you have to go to DC and apply for charitable solicitation, and you have to go to Virginia to apply for charitable solicitation. And that's important because that has financial implications, because there are fees associated with that. Okay, so you just need to think about, as you fundraise, which is why I said earlier, think about what your fundraising plan is and how you're going to raise money, because you need to figure out, okay, we need to put money aside to apply for this in these states where we know we're going to be fundraising. Now, The game changer in all of this is your website. So some states consider a donate button on your website as you soliciting in their state. Even if a person doesn't necessarily donate to you, just the fact that you have the button on your website and people can donate to you may be a cause for applying for charitable solicitation in the state. So I recommend you read up on this. And of course, I have a link for you to read up on this and figure out which states have these requirements. And I know as a new and as a small nonprofit, some of this stuff is like, Tiffany, are you serious? We barely have money to operate. And now we're talking about giving money and we're not even fundraising yet. And we can't have a donate button. I know it can be confusing. And some of this you just have to weigh the risk of delaying, you know, meeting some regulatory requirement or the likelihood that somebody would actually give to you. You just need to weigh those things as a group, which is again why it's important to have a board to make these decisions together, to make sure you guys are doing the best for your organization. The next thing, which is timely after the conversation we just had, is about insurance. So make sure you have the right insurance that you need to protect you as a founder, your staff, and also to protect your board. So there's going to be general liability. If you operate out of a space, you're going to need property insurance. You definitely are going to need what's called D&O, which stands for directors and officers, to protect the board of directors and the officers of the organization from any kind of liability. You may need some kind of umbrella policy. If you serve children, you're absolutely going to need some kind of insurance. So at that point, you need to consider what are your coverages that you need, and you need to just explore a broker who can help you figure out what the applicable coverages are for the type of activities you want to do. The next thing you should think about, and this is not fluffy stuff, I really believe this is important because how you represent yourself as an organization matters. You need to think about your branding and your communication. What ways are you going to communicate to your community about the fact that you exist, about the work that you do? So that means you're going to need a logo. You're going to need consistent branding in terms of colors and fonts and the style of your communications and how you present yourself to the public. You're going to need a website. You're going to need social media presence. So you need to start identifying the branding things that are most important. You need to come up with your style. Are you a traditional organization? Are you more a grassroots organization? What are you? And make sure that your branding reflects that so that when people see you and people see your materials, they have a good sense of who you are. I absolutely recommend you have a website. I absolutely recommend you have social media. At a bare minimum, you need a Facebook page because guess what? People go on Facebook to show that you're credible. People go on Google to see if you're credible. If you're asking for money and you have no presence online, I'm just not going to give to you. So make sure you have some kind of presence so people can see that you're a viable and actually a real organization. Make sure you have some kind of communication strategy about how often you're going to communicate. Make sure you are talking to your public. Make sure there's some kind of activity to show people that you actually exist. This is going to be important when it comes to your funders because funders do check you out. Funders do Google you. They do look on Facebook. So just make sure you have a consistent presence online, but also out physically in the community. The next thing you need to think about are outcomes and evaluation of your programs and the performance of your programs. So, if you want people to support you, people are more comfortable doing that if they see you have some kind of impact. If they see that you have positive outcomes, if you've served a lot of people, if you've done some kind of good. So, you have to have a mechanism in place to show that. So, how are you documenting or how are you measuring how you're doing some kind of good in your community? Because what you're going to do is then take that, spend that, put that on your website, put that in your grant materials, put that on your donor solicitations and say, hey, we served this many people. Hey, we helped this many children. People want to see and hear about good outcomes. People want to see and hear good stories. So you need to have a system in place for collecting that information. So establish some kind of data collection. As soon as you interact with the client, collect some baseline information about who they are, what their needs are. All of this stuff is going to feed into the stuff you're going to need to do in your first year. So have some kind of database about the people you're serving. Make sure you're not collecting too much information, but at least basic information about who they are, maybe the communities they're from, what their most common needs are, or what barriers they're encountering, so that you can track over time how that improves, and you can track over time how your organization has contributed to that. So in order to do that, you have to be clear on what your outcomes are. What is it that you're trying to impact? So if we go back to the sewing example, if you think that sewing has a good impact on young people, in what ways? Does it help with social interactions? Does it help with stress management? You need to think bigger about what is the positive impact. Not, well, it's just going to help them have a better life, or it's going to help them feel better about themselves. You have to start putting that in language in terms of outcomes so that people can latch on to that and say, oh, okay, so sewing helps their overall self-esteem and self-awareness, and that contributes to them in doing well in school and having a good life. Those are the kinds of things you need to be thinking about, and that's the language you need to use as a nonprofit to show your impact. So some of the things you can do to prepare for evaluation and having positive outcomes, make sure you have a logic model in place that shows the progression of your organization, that shows what you provide to your community, to your clients, and how that impacts them in terms of short-term outcomes and long-term outcomes. And make sure you have that as a visual document so you can show your funders what you do, what it is you as an organization, what's the positive impact you have as an organization. The other thing you should have is some kind of outcomes monitoring plan. So, what's your plan for measuring outcomes? Are you measuring them every 6 months? Are you measuring them every month? And as a part of that, you need to have a set of outcomes that you're looking at. So, make sure you have a plan to know what you want to impact, to know what you're looking at, and how often and how you're going to report that out to the public. Also, like I said, have some kind of database to track data. So make sure you have some kind of spreadsheet or some kind of system that you're using to make sure that you're tracking performance data. The last section of the checklist I want to talk about is staffing requirements. And if you're new and you're small, this is something you're not going to be thinking about till later on down the road, because you probably won't be in a position to hire anybody until a couple of years in. But I'd still wanted to talk about it and put it in the checklist because there are some things you can do now to prepare yourself for getting staff later, okay? So the first thing you should do is make sure that whatever requirements with the state to pay staff in terms of having an employee number or an unemployment insurance number, whatever that is, to make sure you investigate that with your state, with your tax authority in your state, and also the Secretary of the State, to make sure you have everything in place. The other thing I recommend is create descriptions for staff. And the reason why this is important, even in the beginning, because sometimes we get so caught up in nonprofits because we do everything and then we say, all I need is a grant writer, or all I need is this kind of person, when it may be that you need something else. And by writing down exactly the job descriptions and thinking critically about, okay, what are the different types of work? What are the different roles and positions I need? By doing that and writing that down, it can help you think more clearly. It may help you realize you actually need something different than what you thought you needed. It may help you realize, oh, these roles can be combined. This can be one person. Or this is too much for one role and we need to make this two. So I recommend that you write down and create job descriptions even in the beginning to help you sort out the help that you really, really need. The other thing you should think about is whether or not you're going to hire employees or independent contractors. Now, there are differences between what constitutes an employee and an independent contractor, and the IRS has been cracking down on this lately. So just be clear on the type of staff that you want. If you're hiring an independent contractor, which means you're not paying any payroll taxes for them, you're not collecting that information for them, then that means they are truly independent. So they have to set their own hours, they set, the pace for their own work. That means they are truly an independent contractor. If that's not the case, then more than likely they're designated as an employee, and you need to have them set up for taking out payroll tax and all of that. So just be clear when you're thinking about your staffing roles, what kind of role it is in terms of whether or not it's an employee or an independent contractor. As you think about your staffing roles, think about the pay for that person. So think about how much you want to pay them, what it's going to take. A lot of people have that question, well, I'm a founder and I want to transition to become the executive director, but I don't know how much money to ask for or what I should be getting. So you should do a market analysis and see what other EDs are getting in the area around you, but also be considerate of the phase that you're in. So if you're in year 2 of your nonprofit and your budget is only 75,000, please don't say, "Oh, I'm going to get paid 125 as an ED because that ED over there is getting 125." Just be realistic and understand the phases that you're in and talk to your board about how that may need to be phased in and create a plan to fundraise to get the level you want to be. But sometimes you have to realize you're not there yet. So just think about when you're thinking about the roles that you need in your organization, also think about the levels of compensation that you're going to give to be able to get that out of someone. Also, make sure that you have a human resources manual that specifies things like time off, holidays, benefits, professional development. All that kind of stuff is important to retaining staff. So you can start working on that even before you're hiring staff so you can be prepared to have that in place when you hire staff. The other thing you need to think about if you're hiring employees is putting a payroll system in place so that you're not the ones writing checks or going through all of that. Hire someone to take care of paying the taxes to the federal government and to the state in terms of unemployment and Medicaid and all of that kind of stuff. Make sure you have a system or a payroll company who can do that for you. Okay. So the other stuff is really about administration and things you need to take care of in terms of your paperwork. I'm just going to run through this quickly. And again, all of this does depend on what state you're in. Some of this is federal paperwork, some of this may have an impact at the state level. But these are just some things I'm going to call out that you should be considering when you are hiring staff. So, have a system in place for filing W-2s. Your payroll company will typically be able to do that for you. But also, if you're hiring independent contractors, make sure you have a system for tracking their hours and being able to report their hours at the end of the year by submitting their 1099s. Make sure you get all the upfront paperwork in terms of their W-9s and getting their information and their social security numbers so you can file at the end of the year. Some payroll systems will do the W-2s and the 1099s. So just consider that when you're looking for a payroll contractor. The other thing is, I just kind of referenced it. Make sure you have upfront data collection procedures in place for people you're hiring. So if you need to collect their emergency information, you need to collect their identifying information, you need to give them an I-9 to confirm citizenship, you need to give them either the W-4 or the W-9 to confirm what type of employee or what kind of staff they are in terms of employee or independent contractor. These are things that are important to get up front because at the end of the year, you're going to be scrambling. I'm talking from firsthand experience here. You're going to be scrambling to get that information in order to file on their behalf to report the income that you gave them. The last thing I'll say for this in terms of staffing is that, this is long down the road, but this is still important. Consider the different insurances you need in reference to having employees. So you may need workman's comp or you need sexual abuse liability if you're working with kids. So I talked about insurance earlier, but these are insurances that are directly related to hiring staff that you won't need until you hire staff. So just consider what your different coverages may need to be now that you have staff in place. Also consider health benefits and retirement benefits. When you're thinking about staff, you also need to think about how to retain them because it can be really expensive to hire staff and to onboard them. So it's to your advantage to hire and keep staff, to keep them happy, to keep them motivated, and benefits can do that. So you will need to consider how to pay health benefits and how to help with retirement benefits. So just keep that in mind. That may not be needed at the startup phase, but hey, you may be in a place where you can hire right now. So these are things that you need to consider as you're starting your nonprofit. So that's it. That's the checklist. I wanted to go through step by step. I thought it was important for you to hear the background of why you should do these steps and why you should do them in this order. I hope it was helpful. If it was, please let me know in the comment box below, or if there's something that you want me to explain more or a different kind of video that you want, please feel free to comment and I'll be happy to do that. As always, if you have questions for me, reach out to me at www.bostonbudget.com and I will see you in the next video.